I want to share with you a story that transformed my life. When I was 41 years old, my mother passed away. And when she passed away, I entered the deepest grief, the deepest pain I had ever experienced in my entire life. I went through a level of depression, a level of anxiety, a level of fear, unlike anything I had ever experienced. Up until that point in my life, everything was perfect. I had achieved everything I needed to have to be happy. I had the house, the cars, the children, the wonderful husband, the career, everything was absolutely perfect. And I began to feel this incredible pain, like something was missing. And after about 2 years of grieving my mother, intensely grieving, I had a friend who said to me, "Girl, this grieving seems to be a little bit out of control. What's going on with you?" And that's when I began to tap in that what I was actually afraid of was the death of me. I felt that if I were to have died at that time, I had not been living fully. So I entered into this journey of discovering who am I really. And I went on what's called a spiritual journey, a journey of self-awareness, of finding out what happened to me. Because when I was a little bitty girl, I remember at 8 years old, nothing would stop me. The whole world was my stage. I was so happy. I had so many nicknames. It was outrageous, the nicknames that I had, and they all were about being happy, one of them was I was dynamite. I was absolutely always dancing and moving. I was the one that everybody looked to because I was so happy. So what happened to that 8-year-old that at 41, I felt like I was dead inside? My spiritual journey took me on a quest of finding out that my mind had been conditioned to believe that I needed to stop being authentically me because I was trying to please people, my father, my mother, my teacher, my preacher, the media, the government. Everybody was telling me how I was supposed to live my life. And I began to realize that I stopped being myself when I became a people pleaser. And I then became addicted to people telling me, "You look beautiful. You're doing wonderful. You're so special. I love you." So when people began to tell me that I matter to them, I began to get a high. And then something miraculous happened. As I began to discover that I actually had this voice inside of me, this happy self, as I began to listen to that voice deliberately, I became aware, where's that voice coming from? I began to feel this divine energy inside of me. I began to feel the Creator inside of me. I grew up Catholic, and I had spent an entire lifetime believing that God was out there, up in heaven, on a cloud somewhere. And I needed to be a good girl so that God would approve of me. And I began to realize through my journey that God was actually inside of me. It was this voice that was powering me. It was my joy. It was my essence. It was my truth. And when I began to listen to that voice inside of me, I realized that I actually had two voices. I had that voice of God that was just empowering me and telling me, "Be who you are." And then I had a voice in my head, the one that told me, "Oh, you better get approval from those people out there, because if they like you, that's more important than you liking yourself." And then life gave me another gift. About 5 years later, my son, who at the time was 14 years old, he began to take drugs. And he began to enter this journey of addiction. And as he was taking drugs to make himself feel better, I said, okay, I know what's happening to him, because I had become aware of what had happened to me. See, I gave birth to that child. I knew him. I knew him as a happy child. I knew him as a vibrant, a kid that everybody, even the adults, loved being around this beautiful being. He radiated. I knew when I met him that he was the presence of God itself, that he was divine, this beautiful little angel. So what happened to him? How did he go from being confident and knowing who he was to having to take drugs to feel good about himself? And that's when I began to put two and two together. See, I knew he had that voice of God inside of him. I knew he had that voice of authenticity, that voice of happiness, that voice that told him, you are all that, because he was created perfect. So then I knew what had happened to him as he began to hear that voice in his head, that voice of that ego mind, the voice of society telling him he's not good enough. He needs to try a little harder. He needs to work extra hard to be approved of. And we lived in an area in the United States that it's a very high achieving area. So I had put my children in a school that I thought would prepare them to live a wonderful life. But what I had done is I put my children in a school that has a school system that prepares them to become what the system needs them to become, prepares them to be these cookie cutter corporate people. And when I began to realize that my son is not a cookie cutter kid, he is quite unique, as was I. That's when I began to make an agreement with him. And I said to my son, listen, sweetheart, you are taking drugs because you feel bad about yourself. So I'm not gonna take the one thing that helps you feel good. So go ahead and take those drugs, because when you come down from those drugs, the agreement is we're going to look at those beliefs that are in your mind, those ego thoughts that are telling you you're not okay. So we danced this dance for 4 years, 4 years. He would go on his high to feel good, and when he came off of the drugs, we went down into those low, deep places where we discovered a third grade teacher who told him he was screwing up, a friend who didn't invite him to an event, a father who might have disregarded him for some reason, a mother who at times had no time for him, a sister who was so busy with her own stuff she couldn't be bothered to spend time with him when he needed it most. So little by little, we began to look at the places where he began to lose himself, where he began to need somebody else's approval to feel good about himself. And that journey was not an easy journey. But what I know for sure is that every single one of us has that voice of truth inside of us. We have the essence of the Creator. No matter what you call it, God, Spirit, Buddha, Allah, you can call it Bambi, you can call it whatever you want to call it. But it is the essence of life. It's what powers us. It's our authenticity. And we all have that voice, but we get trained out of listening to that voice in here because our mind gets conditioned to listen to the voice out there. So I want to empower people to become aware that deep inside of them is their life force. And if they don't tap into their life force, they're going to feel empty. And guess what happens when we feel empty? We have to fill that hole. And we will use, my drug of choice was approval, people pleasing, margaritas, shopping. For him, it was drugs. For a lot of people, it's power, it's money, it's career, it's accolades. It's the corner office. Every single one of us has the ability to tap into that wholeness. Become aware of who you truly are, and when you do, you will come to the place where you will meet your maker. And once you meet that essence that is inside of you, you will never need to look outside of yourself ever again for what makes you happy. You will be the happiness itself. Thank you.